Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Front Page Fitness. This is episode number 2. I am Eric Drexler. I am here with the Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple. Lauren, how are you doing today?
I am in the Hamilton, Ontario, recently back from a trip to the Melbourne, Australia, and I'm doing great.
And how was that trip?
It was good. It's summertime in Australia, so a welcome break from the winter weather that is Canada.
You guys are still doing winter up there?
It is currently blizzarding and freezing rain on
You're kidding me.
April 2nd. Yay.
Okay, interesting. So I am in the beautiful state of North Carolina, of which many songs have been written. It truly is a wonderful state. However, this is something I would not believe had I not seen it. This is a real thing, which I did not think could happen. But we're at this brief period in the year where there is so much pollen that it's visible. Like you look out and it looks like there's yellow fog. It is just suspended in the air all around you. If you park at work and leave your car, you come back and there's a thick coating of just yellow pollen all over your car. You can literally write messages in it. So all that is to say, I'm fighting for my life. Okay. I love it here, but I could do without this 2-week period every year where all the pine trees just pollinate the world. My respiratory system is on its last legs, and I will probably either sneeze or fight back a sneeze 3 or 4 times during this recording. So are you ready for that?
Yeah, just mute yourself. So when I lived in Florida, there was this love bug season, which basically these bugs that are apparently native to Florida land on your car and have sex on your windshield and then stain your car. And so this would be about love bug season.
Yeah. I grew up in Ohio, and Ohio was very boring, but what we did not have was insane allergens everywhere, nor did we have prehistoric bugs. I remember moving, and North Carolina is like the tip of the South. You know, you're just getting into the South when you're in North Carolina. But it's South enough for me to have been alarmed by the sheer size and I'm trying to think of the right word for it, but just the exotic nature of some of the bugs down here are very, very different from anything you see up north. And
what do you see in North Carolina? Because I wouldn't have pegged that for North Carolina, actually.
So here's a funny story. When I moved to North Carolina, before I knew you, my first year in North Carolina, I lived in the basement of a very eccentric old woman. And it was a great situation because it was this kind of 1-bedroom-ish kind of studio apartment she had set up in her basement with just enough of a kitchen for a first-year grad student to make it work. And I could walk to my lab in 10 minutes, which is unheard of in Chapel Hill. It's not built that way. And so for me, I had to get to work before the buses start, and I had to leave after the last bus left. So walking... Did I mute it?
You did.
All right, first sneeze of the day. Walking was all I could do, so I had to be close enough to make that walk happen.
Sneeze number 2 and 3.
Oh, this is terrible. We might need to call it. I don't know if I can breathe. Okay, so anyway, no, I'm good. So I was living in the basement of this eccentric woman's home, and because it was just the only thing I could do to make it walkable. And the door to my apartment, there was a 2-inch gap between the bottom of my door and the backyard, which was forest. It was just pure wilderness. So you could a snake could slither under my door. That was the kind of gap that we had. And one time I did come home from work, and it wasn't in my house, but there was actually a venomous copperhead coiled up right in front of my door as if it was just waiting for me to get there. And I nearly stepped on it, which would have been terrible. But they probably won't kill you, but you'll feel it. You don't want to get bit by any venomous snakes. But anyway, because of this gap in the door, I became intimately familiar, and because of the proximity to forest, every kind of bug that exists in North Carolina was living in my apartment, and they were absolutely massive. I don't know what it is about the heat and the humidity, that southern climate. I need to. I'm in the biological sciences building here at Duke, so I should probably just walk down the hallway and ask a bug expert what is happening in the southeast. But it was just the sheer size was something no one prepared me for, and I certainly wasn't ready for on my own. And I've imagined, I mean, you must have seen some absolute menacing bugs in Florida.
Yeah, I mean, in New York City, we have some pretty disgusting cockroaches because once they get into an apartment building, like
Yeah.
they are in your apartment or in the outlets or the walls, or it's really disgusting. But Florida was definitely grosser because you don't know what it is, and they're huge and they show up seemingly out of nowhere. I also had a snake experience. I was leaving for a trip and I opened my front door and there was this huge snake just blocking my exit.
Yeah.
And so it's like, do I miss my plane? Do I jump over the snake with suitcase? That's what I ended up doing. But yeah.
Yeah, in the
Okay.
South, snakes are kind of like cave troll or like bridge trolls where they just kind of camp out there near a doorway and they won't let you in or out unless you give them what they want or answer some series of riddles. So snakes are certainly something you want to watch out for. Of course, coming back from Australia, I'm sure that you saw no shortage of insanely dangerous venomous snakes there as well, and spiders the size of dinner plates. So all of that is to say, don't go anywhere. There's bad things out there. And I will say to your point,
Stay home.
yeah, about New York, that's not even a north-south thing. I feel like New York is just buried deep into its culture is just things that are kind of nasty. You know what I mean? And I say that with
Wow.
respect and appreciation.
Mm.
Um, but I mean, let's be honest. A New York subway rat is its own species of rodent. We can agree on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they are.
Hopefully, and usually they're in the tracks, which is, they can't get you because the tracks are below the platform. But occasionally you do see one on the platform and you run, especially if you're wearing flip-flops.
Yeah. Now, is it
Don't wear
true?
flip-flops in the subway.
Someone
Pro
told
tip.
me about New York City rats that you don't see them until you see one, and then you see them everywhere. Does that match your experience?
No.
Okay.
Because okay, the problem is there's garbage everywhere in New York City. Like, no, there's even when you're disposing of it, as a business or a restaurant, the way that you are supposed to, it's just piles and piles of garbage bags on the street.
Yeah. And
And
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I have to because you acted offended when I said New York was just kind of nasty in general, and now you're talking about the piles of trash on the street. So,
it's part of the charm.
meet me halfway though.
It's part of the charm.
Yeah.
It's a small island, not a lot of places to dispose of.
But as you were, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So the rats are in the darker places, so you see them in the subways, you see them at night. But they also have these weird blown up rats outside of hotels. I don't really know what that was about, but that was
Like
a thing
inflatable.
for years. Like inflatable rats, like huge, the size of buildings. They would have them, and people would be protesting something. I'm not sure what, but that was weird and kind of disturbing.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Well, Lauren, I'm glad
Fun
that you are
fact about
back.
New York.
I'm glad that you are back in Canada enjoying your winter part two. But we have some serious business to discuss today. So as I mentioned last episode, you are the person who does a lot of the true heroic work of kind of finding interesting headlines for us to talk about. And this one jumped out at me because part of it hit close to home, but I'm curious to learn more about it. The headline was, Everett gained 13 pounds of muscle mass after eating 30 eggs daily for a month. So that sounds a bit extreme. It's not 6 to 9 pounds a day of cheese, which we covered last episode. So I feel like we started with such an alarming dietary pattern that now it's like we can't top that. It's like 30 eggs a day, no big deal. Who doesn't eat 30 eggs a day? But I'm just going to ask you a series of questions here, and we can kind of take it from there. But when I first hear someone's eating 30 eggs daily for a month, especially in this economy where eggs are about $20 a pop,
Mm.
the first question would be, why? What is the point of this? What is one hoping to prove when they eat 30 eggs a day for a month?
So this YouTuber and I guess this channel in general is sort of dedicated to testing different claims and trying to do an N of one experiment, right? So uh, there was a bodybuilder who claimed back in the day that eating this many eggs was equivalent to taking a dose of steroids in terms of putting on muscle. And so this particular influencer was going to try to implement that diet and measure various markers of strength, uh, body composition. I'm not sure if he actually measured body composition, but I know he measured his weight and took some before and after pictures, measured strength performance, and also did some blood work because he was testing the claim that perhaps eating that many eggs would increase his testosterone.
Yeah. And so I assume that the premise here, when you talk about eggs being, having some kind of steroid-like effect, it's probably tapping into that kind of classic thought that people have put out in many different places across the internet over the years, and even before the internet. This idea that because, saturated fat and cholesterol, or specifically cholesterol, is a precursor to testosterone production endogenously, the idea is you eat more saturated fat and cholesterol, your body has more cholesterol in it available, therefore you're going to produce more testosterone, and essentially you're on steroids. That's kind of the premise.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I know it's never as simplistic as that, but that was the premise.
My greatest enemies are going to clip that as if I'm stating it as fact, and it's going to derail my entire career. So it was
You'll
nice.
be TikTok famous for that clip.
Absolutely. So my understanding is this individual was eating about 3,500 calories a day, obviously plenty of protein. But as I was looking through it, it seemed like he, he sprinted out of the gates and immediately hit some speed bumps, specifically when it comes to gastrointestinal symptoms. So can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes. So apparently, his girlfriend would no longer let him sleep in the bed anymore because he was experiencing some really disturbing flatulence.
I don't want to turn this into like a relationship advice show, but what's his name? Everett, honey. This woman does not support you. She's not there for you in your time of need. This is not the kind of person that you want to grow old with by your side. I'm sorry. But Lauren, surely you can agree. This is through thick and thin. Even if your partner is eating 30 eggs daily for a month, you have to be there for him. You can't just bail when the going gets tough.
She's naggy and unreasonable.
All right.
Break up with
We're in
her.
agreement. So it's worth noting. I think we mentioned this, but if we didn't, it's worth noting for sure. Initially, he was starting out going, were they all raw eggs
They
at the
were
beginning?
all raw eggs.
Yeah, so just kind of Rocky, the motion picture style, just cracking eggs into a cup and
No, he was making these smoothies with mango.
oh, okay. I mean, I like mango, and I could see how maybe that masks some of the flavor of like an egg yolk, but
But adds to the GI issues for sure.
adds to the GI issues, and also, man, the idea of an egg yolk in a smoothie, the texture, I that would do it for me. I would not be able to live with that texture.
Would you rather do the 9 pounds of butter or the egg yolk smoothie? Raw egg yolk mango smoothie. I think it was frozen mango. So, okay, no, he described it as like a mango ice cream.
Yeah, because with that texture, you're not going to get it to a smoothie. It's going to be like, yeah, way too thick. Um, man, that's tough. That is a really tough because it's like if you told me I had to have like a reasonable but large one or the other, right? So like a reasonable but large serving of this mango ice cream, or the was it the butter or the cheese that you threw at me?
The cheese, the
The
nine
cheese.
pounds of cheese, yeah.
If it was just like 2 pounds of cheese, I would do that and consider it to be a pretty good time, honestly.
Yeah.
But the 6 pounds, I just don't know if I could physically make that happen. So that really is. I'm just gonna have to opt out of both and take whatever penalty is associated with that, because they both just sound terrible to me.
Oh, any listeners who took on the Cheese Whiz challenge from last episode can also do the mango egg yolk challenge and then compare and report back.
So this is another one that troubles me. I know that there's like a lot of people who push back if you acknowledge the reality that like you could get foodborne illness from eating uncooked eggs. I understand many people have done it and they don't all immediately succumb to severe foodborne illness. But I also, again, because we don't have that attorney on retainer yet, I feel like we have to go at least one episode with not encouraging people to do severely dangerous things to themselves, or putting them, I wouldn't say severely, putting themselves in harm's way potentially.
I mean, you're a buzzkill.
I am indeed, but my record of being sued is 0 for 0, and it's one I'm very proud of, and I'd like to retain it.
Okay.
All right, so first started out with raw eggs, 30 a day, had some GI issues, and I believe the girlfriend, quote unquote, I don't think she's right for him. I don't think they're right for each other, to be honest. But apparently she came back around when he started cooking. Is that correct?
He actually didn't give us a relationship update, so
Maybe he finally picked up on it and decided to move on with his life. But it is worth noting. So the reason I asked if they closed the loop on that, maybe that's the next video, was just like a deep dive into their relationship and how things are going.
yeah, let's hear from her. I mean, come on. He's eating all the eggs.
Yeah.
He's stinking up the bed.
Okay, I will say this. Maybe I didn't give her a fair shake. Maybe she has a totally different account of how things went. So I retract my prior statements, even though we agreed. And I'm going to say, let's hear her out on the next video on this channel, and we'll weigh in on who was right and who was wrong. But the reason I brought up cooking is because it's really hard for the human digestive system to digest raw uncooked egg. When you cook egg, it actually becomes much more digestible and much more bioavailable. It is generally a very positive thing to cook eggs, which is so crazy. It blows my mind that like when people decide that they're going to get really serious, they're not just going to have a lovely, delicious omelet. They're like, no, I am going to take a good thing and make it gross. And instead of just cooking it like a normal person, I am going to drink it in the grossest way possible. And it's like, not only are you making, I think that's just Lauren, now that you're Canadian officially, I think you can look at this from the outside with objective eyes. I think that's just an innately, I don't think it's uniquely, but I definitely think it is an innately American thing of just like, if I make this way harder and less pleasant, that has to be good. You know what I mean? So people watch the Rocky movies and they're like, oh, he's training in the snow drinking eggs. That's got to be way better than going to a well-equipped gym and having an omelet. But in reality, folks, it's not. So if you want to get the most out of your eggs and not alienate yourself from the most important people in your life, just cook your eggs.
But if you are eating that many eggs, that's rough, right? Like if it's easier to, theoretically, to crush more eggs in liquid form than it would be in an omelet form. I mean, think about a 30, well, okay, let's say you're spreading it out throughout the day, but even think about a 10 egg omelet or 6 5-egg omelets.
You're barking up the wrong tree. Because back in the day when I was, this is like total bodybuilding folklore terminology. I did one dreamer bulk in my life, and the origin story of that is way too long a story to tell. But A dreamer bulk, colloquially, refers to just eating way more than you could possibly justify and trying to gain as much weight as possible. You delude yourself into believing it's muscle. Spoiler alert, it's not a bad idea.
How much weight did you gain?
Um, so when I went to college, I wrestled my senior year at about 145 pounds. And by the end of my freshman year of college, and of course, I cut weight down to that, a little cut. But by the end of my first year of college, I was pretty close to 200 pounds. So I probably gained a good, legit 40 pounds in that first year of college. Now, bear in mind, I had been lifting since I was 12. And even by the age of like 15 or 16, you know, huge caveat, big fish in a small pond. Nobody is jacked when they're 16. But I had been lifting enough that as a 16-year-old, I was known as the weirdly jacked 16-year-old in my high school. All of that is to say, it's not like a lot of kids who go to college and touch a weight for the first time and they get all their beginner gains. This was me going off of, I had been lifting real hard for several years straight and then tacked on a good 40 or 50 pounds that year. So I was eating hard and I was eating consistently. And part of that was every day I'd have a good 10 to 12 egg omelet. And I found that to be a very pleasant experience. But my daily diet would include that. It would include a whole pizza from Costco. It would include a big old plate of spaghetti with chicken breast in it. This was a fun one. Every morning I would get the little chicken breast, the little kind of strips of grilled chicken. They call them like tenderloin. You know what I'm talking about?
The pre-cooked ones, or
no, they weren't
raw?
pre-cooked, but they're just like the little slivers that they taste like chicken breast.
Like still tenderloin.
Yeah, I think that's what they were called. Yeah. But anyway, I would make like 2 pounds of that and I would put it in a Ziploc bag and just carry it around all day and eat it. And one time a student in a colleague, I was 18. I don't know. I just reverted to like professor language there. But a colleague of mine, a peer, was like, why do you carry that big bag of cookies around all day? Is saying basically, this is very strange behavior that you have these large wafer-like cookies you're carrying. And to me, it felt like I was explaining this and making it more normal. But I said, oh, no. Those are just little tiny bits of chicken. And that I was eating at like 8 in the morning.
Yeah, that's weird.
And to me, I was explaining and elaborating in a way that would bring some closure. And then they looked infinitely more confused than if I just brought a bag of cookies around everywhere I went. So all that is to say, I have been here doing the 12 egg omelets daily, 10 to 12.
How much pan do you need for a 12 egg omelet? And does it cook evenly?
No. We're talking about a college kid omelet. I mean, you cook the eggs enough to be digestible. You throw some stuff in the middle. You try to turn it over and just use cheese to patch up everything. That's a college kid omelet. But anyway, yeah. So I thought that was fun. And if I wasn't trying to also get the 2 pounds of chicken breast and the big plate of spaghetti and the pizza every night and all the other stuff, I feel like I could have done 3 a day. But nonetheless, it's definitely a choice. And it's definitely a commitment to go for these 30 eggs a day, whether you're going raw or cooked. But I know for me, surely I would have been going cooked because I even my rudimentary omelet skills made it appealing enough to skip out on the whole Rocky montage of chugging egg yolks.
Okay, fair enough.
But Lauren, let's get down to business here. So this individual is through this journey, obviously exposed a lot of cracks, a lot of fault lines in their relationship, which we'll get to, I'm sure, in a future episode.
That's the real story here.
Yeah, that's the real
story. How raw eggs ruined a relationship.
Absolutely. But when it comes down to the results, they went into it probably thinking my testosterone's going to go up. I'm going to get super jacked. Maybe my cholesterol will also go way up and I'll have to kind of weigh the pros versus the cons of testosterone and getting jacked versus maybe messing up my blood lipids. So at the end of the day, what was the result of this whole experiment?
Yeah. So, I mean, to his credit, he was very transparent in saying that he wasn't a serious lifter kind of going into this experiment, and he became one for the experiment. So not surprisingly, he gained strength, through the before and after pictures, we can tell that he probably put on some muscle. He did gain weight. I think the weight that he put on wasn't all muscle if we're just assessing visually, and I think he would probably agree with that as well. But interestingly, his testosterone levels didn't change, and his HDL, which is considered sort of the good cholesterol, increased, but his LDL, or the quote unquote bad cholesterol, didn't meaningfully change. It was kind of a modest increase.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I mean, you pointed out that was one of the reasons that I don't, it's not just that I peaked in high school and I want to remind everyone how jacked I was when I was 16, but it's pertinent to this story that, for folks who are listening, who are more into health, less into fitness, when you first start lifting weights, you gain a lot of muscle and strength quickly. That's just how it works. If you're doing it right, that's how it works. So that's why it's pertinent to not just say, hey, how much did you gain this year? Or how much did you gain during this 1 month challenge? You have to know what was your starting point. Because if someone just starts lifting, they're going to make a ton of progress. So it sounds like this person kind of dabbled with a little lifting, but definitely cranked it up a lot. And so we should expect that whether they were eating 30 eggs a day or 0 eggs a day, or anything in between, they were going to put on some muscle. But to your point, I mean, having looked at the pictures, I mean, I'm sure you've measured body composition many times in your life. My master's and PhD, the lab I was in, we did tons of body comp analysis. I mean, I've done thousands of body composition analyses. So I have a pretty good eye, especially as a former competitive bodybuilder, of, how much is fat, how much is muscle. And there's definitely gains to be proud of. No question about that. There was some fat gain, but that's always the case when you're, you know, gaining weight, eating 3,500 calories a day, etc. But yeah, in terms of like the outward kind of results, it's like, hey, you got bigger, you got stronger, lipids didn't blow up in your face, testosterone didn't change much. So at the end of the day, it's not as much as like you look at the prompt here. I'm going to do 30 eggs daily for a month. There's the sticker shock of kind of how extreme that intervention is.
Yeah.
But what struck me was how non-extreme the results were. It was just kind of like, this is what happens when you eat plenty of protein and calories and lift some weights.
Yeah, I think it's also possible because we don't know what he was eating before, and so it's also possible that it wasn't that much of a surplus, or perhaps it was a protein increase, but it was definitely an increase in lifting. So we don't really know, but 3,500 calories a day isn't an astronomical amount of calories for an average man. I mean, it's probably a surplus, but it's not like he's eating 10,000 calories a day. So it's not that surprising that he gained weight, but not all muscle.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I'm going to go out on a limb here. Lauren, you have studied sex hormones at a high level. It was a big portion of your PhD work. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you were not surprised to see the lack of meaningful change in testosterone. Is that
I was
correct?
not. No.
Yeah. So folks who are in the biz tend to know that it is true. If you want to get out the old biochemistry textbook and dust it off, cholesterol is a precursor to endogenous testosterone synthesis, which means just the testosterone that you're synthesizing and producing in your own body. However, cells are generally able to produce their own cholesterol. Cholesterol, while it does play, like on paper, a role in that synthesis pathway, that does not mean that your body's waiting around for a big influx of dietary cholesterol so it can go ahead and do its thing. You are going to have plenty of cholesterol that you are producing in order to make the testosterone that you need to make if you're on a healthy, balanced diet, and you do not need to be titrating your dietary cholesterol as if it's going to have some direct impact on, day-to-day fluctuations in your sex hormones. And
I think
Lauren,
it's also more important to it's equally important to point out that you can't target a particular, nutrient coming in to a particular outcome of interest. It's just not how it works. That even goes for dietary protein. Just because you're eating dietary protein doesn't mean all of those amino acids are just going right to the muscle. Like it's not how it works. It's the body will use it for what the body needs it for. And so there just isn't really that direct correlation.
Yeah. Now, I do want to acknowledge there is something that you can do from a dietary perspective that can pretty reliably reduce your testosterone production, and that is be super restrictive. So, for example, if instead of doing 30 eggs daily for a month, if this individual wanted to do a very different challenge where he said, I'm going to eat only 1,000 calories a day for a month, I can tell you with a high level of confidence that person's testosterone would have gone down. So severe energy restriction or severe dietary fat restriction, those can both cause reductions in endogenous testosterone levels. Are those changes necessarily big enough to make a big difference in terms of, muscularity, body composition? Debatable. Depends on how extreme an intervention that we're talking. But I don't want to falsely imply that your testosterone production and your diet are fully unrelated. I just want to be very clear that you cannot just hypercholesterol your way to supercharging testosterone and as the theory goes, kind of being on steroids without being on steroids. That's just not how it works. And Lauren, on a related topic, talking about these results, I think some folks might be a little bit surprised that Everett's cholesterol numbers did not look terrible. So last week we talked about, the 6 to 9 pounds of cheese and 6 of butter a day and all that stuff. And we saw cholesterol spiking over 1,000. We did not see any meaningful kind of noteworthy changes to write home about in this particular experiment. And we shouldn't be totally shocked about that. And the reason being, the relationship between nutrient intake and circulating cholesterol levels, especially if we're talking about like LDL, it's not quite as simple as the basic public health messaging would suggest. So back in the day, if you go back to like the 80s, people would say, hey, limit your dietary cholesterol, even into the 90s and beyond. They would say, hey, limit your dietary cholesterol because we want to keep your blood cholesterol low. If you skip to like more modern recommendations, even from the same government entities that were making those recommendations 20, 30, 40 years ago, now, at least the last time I checked, they just didn't say anything about cholesterol, because that link between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol, there's been a lot of evidence to cast a lot of doubt on exactly how closely the two are linked. So a lot of guidelines now just don't even give you a recommendation about cholesterol and treat your dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol as essentially just fairly unrelated things. Now, generally speaking, if someone, for some reason, were going out of their way and saying, I want to spike my LDL cholesterol, which I would not recommend, what they would probably do is eat a ton of saturated fat. That is still, if you look at the guidelines, if someone has high cholesterol, they'd say, hey, you probably ought to take it easy on the saturated fat. And even that is still an oversimplification. Lauren, as you know, there are many different types of specific fatty acids that fall under the umbrella of saturated fat, and they don't all have the same exact effect on blood lipids, which means the blood lipid effect of a high-fat diet where a lot of the fat's coming from eggs is going to look different versus if the fat was coming primarily from high-fat milk or cheese curds or beef or 6 to 9 pounds a day of Cheese Whiz or fondue. All these different fat sources, even though we would broadly say, oh, those have plenty of saturated fat in them, they're going to have different effects on circulating blood lipids. So I just want to be really clear that eggs, it's really interesting. Some people go to bat really hard for eggs and they say every potentially negative thing you've heard about them is a myth and a lie, and whoever said it is a coward and they're the perfect superfood. And then other folks will say, hey, there's a lot of cholesterol, there's some saturated fat, stay away, or maybe have one in your breakfast and have like 6 egg whites. The reality is somewhere in the middle with foods. You don't want to You don't need to have 30 a day. And in this economy, who could afford it, Lauren? There's a big egg shortage. But
And
yeah,
they're
so
not more expensive in Australia, by the way.
oh, really? Do they not have bird flu going around?
No, because they're an
Wow.
island. They
I
can
thought
fly
birds
shit.
could get to islands. I thought that was the whole deal
They
with
have to
birds.
fly really far to get to Australia.
Yeah.
They have a lot of native species, and they don't have a lot of the species we have here. So
Well, hey, I'm happy for him. I was a year ahead of the bird flu scare because I used to get my eggs from a local animal rescue where basically they would rescue chickens who were living in tough situations or their owners surrendered them and said, I can't take care of these chickens anymore. And so they lived on this farm as just kind of like an animal refuge, animal rescue kind of thing. But there was also a huge dog adoption facility that was linked into this animal rescue. And so what they would do is they would sell the chickens' eggs because they're going to lay them anyway. And they would use that money to take care of all the animals. And so they would say that the eggs that the chickens were laying was just them paying their rent, basically, for living on the animal rescue. But unfortunately, like 2 years ago, maybe even three, the whole flock actually died because uh, a very malicious, bad bird from the wrong side of town flew over. And when they're living out on the farm like that, you can't keep them separated from the wild bird population. And so,
right.
yeah, that was even before people were making a big deal about it. But anyway, all that is to say, eggs are expensive now, and we can probably blame Everett to some extent for the shortage in America because I
For
think
sure.
he was clearing out the shelves.
Yeah.
All right, Lauren, we need to move on to our next story here, next headline. And let's see. Yes, the headline here is recent Netflix show Apple Cider Vinegar and documentary Instagram's Worst Con Artist are based on the story of influencer Belle Gibson. And so this one really caught my eye because I actually just published a couple months ago a letter to the editor literally about apple cider vinegar, where a paper reported some very eye-popping results. And my letter to the editor with some colleagues basically said, those are some interesting results. I'd love to hear more about them. And we were told, you will not be able to see this data. Just be impressed by the eye-popping effects and be quiet is pretty much the response we got. So apple cider vinegar immediately triggers my sense of suspicion and skepticism.
Mm.
So what can you tell me about this new, it sounds like a couple pieces of media. Who is this Belle Gibson character? And did you specifically go to Australia to find her and confront her?
I did, and sadly, I was unable to locate her, but I did
What
want
a
to.
coward. Hiding.
Yeah, I mean,
Hiding in the outback.
it's really, really some bullshit. But she was an influencer on Instagram, one of the early influencers, kind of before being an influencer was a thing. This is kind of 2013, 14. And she went on Instagram and announced to her followers that she had been diagnosed with a terminal brain cancer and had been given 4 months to live, but had decided not to opt for the standard of care and the treatment that might, kind of prolong her life, that it was an incurable cancer, again, according to her, but instead try to manage on her own with diet and lifestyle changes. And she went on to create this website, app, and book that was all geared towards these recipes that she was creating around this healthy lifestyle. The recipes are not anything unique, really. It was things like juicing, and there was a beet soup, and there were, I thought you'd like a beet soup.
My
And
PhD was on beetroot juice, so she's trying to take a shot across the bow. So I needed to address that.
fair enough. This blew up, and people were following it. The book, the app was called The Whole Pantry, and not only were just the general public supporting her because, how can you not? This person has this cancer diagnosis, and she's still this successful entrepreneur, and she's trying to optimize her health. And she's also an influencer for the cancer community. She's, this person to look up to in the cancer community because she looks amazing and she's thriving and she's traveling. And unlike the people in the cancer community who are undergoing radiation and chemotherapy, this person, looks healthy as ever. And long story short, she did not have cancer. She was never diagnosed with cancer. And this whole thing was a shtick. And she really fooled everyone. There's a lot of problems here because, this book was published by a really reputable publisher. This app was promoted by top tier tech companies. And
didn't you say previously when we were chatting offline, didn't it come as like a default app in like iPhones for a while?
It was when the Apple Watch premiered. It was one of the apps that kind of came pre-installed on your Apple Watch, if you can believe that. And she did this whole event like in Silicon Valley, like at Apple.
So it's like, it's not just like I have an app. It's like my app is the pinnacle of success for health-oriented apps.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first Apple Watch came with like 20 apps or something. It's crazy that there even was an app like that on the first Apple Watch. And she did these philanthropy events where she said that she was raising money and donating the proceeds to, a family of somebody who was suffering with the same cancer that she was, or, cancer foundations in general. And it turns out she never actually gave them any of that money. And the whole thing was a scam.
Yeah. So I have a two-part question. So just answer the first and then I'll ask the second, depending on how it goes. So my first question is, have you considered in your cynical heart that maybe she just got a false diagnosis from an incompetent doctor and she was as surprised as anyone else to learn that she didn't have cancer 4 years later or however long this was?
So the friends that I did watch this documentary, and the friends that confronted her and the interview she did that she never should have done, like in the media in Australia at the time, she explained the diagnosis, and it was somebody came to her house and I put some electrodes on her body and then printed something out and told her she had cancer.
You have got to be kidding me. How? Okay, so now I'm more skeptical than ever because, listen, at some point this person convinced powerful people with deep pockets about their story, and it's like, brother, you've been running a fake cancer scam and you don't have the slightest idea of how cancer gets diagnosed?
And these physicians weren't anywhere to be found.
Oh my God, that's insane. That, to me, that's the most alarming thing about this whole, I am learning that for the first time and I'm genuinely stunned that someone would have this scam going, that there's like a whole economy tied to it. And they would not take 10 minutes to go on Wikipedia and say, how did people find out they had cancer? That's pretty wild. Okay, but here's my follow-up question.
Or that whole story is a lie. Right?
Yeah. So my follow-up question, Lauren, as you know, I had a similar racket going where I was falsely diagnosed with cancer. But this was...
And you wrote a book and you had an app?
A real doctor that told me, hey, bro, you probably have cancer. We'll do the test. We'll do some blood work to confirm, but like, you got it. So we're going to have
What kind of cancer were you falsely diagnosed with?
Listen, we don't need to get into all my details here. There were some abdominal lumps and masses that were allegedly found. And so they immediately send me down to get ultrasound done on like my whole abdomen area. And they're like, we're going to do ultrasound and we're going to do blood tests and we're going to do all this stuff. But basically, before we got into all the details of, what kind of tumor and all that stuff, it was basically like, brother, you got cancer. We need to do some imaging to figure out, because I had symptoms that I was going to the doctor for like over a year. So he was like, we're not worried about what kind it is. We're worried about which kinds you have because it's been, brother, like, yeah, you've had it for a while.
Right.
Like, because cancer for
It's not about which cancer it is, it's which cancer it isn't.
exactly, yeah. So he's like, I don't even really want to commit to that because like, let's get some imaging and some blood work, and we'll just start out with a big old list and start crossing things off to see where all the metastasis has occurred. But it was a bad scene, and he was confident enough that before we did the imaging, when the blood was getting sent off for blood work, he basically was already kind of talking about different treatment options. But yeah, basically under the assumption that you've got at least a couple kinds of cancer going on, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that was a disaster. That happened on a Friday. And so they actually like the imaging people stayed late on a Friday because it was like the last appointment of the day. And he was like, you guys can't leave. We gotta start as soon as possible on this. So like we do some imaging, and
We're laughing because he didn't have cancer,
yeah,
to be
yeah.
clear.
So they do the image, and like on one point I appreciated that they were staying late on a Friday for me. On the other hand, I was like, bro, I'm so dead. Like I was like, this is so bad. Everyone's acting like this is a severe emergency. It was like the people I was talking to were acting like I was at my funeral, and they're just like, oh, dude, okay, like lay down over here. So it was just
That's
absolute
so problematic for so many reasons.
yeah, it was not good. So I've never been back to that facility, needless to say.
Yeah.
Um, but it was like a very reputable hospital that's associated with an extremely reputable medical school. So I wasn't like, in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, that was on a Friday. And on the Monday, obviously then people take a look at the different imaging that was done. People take a look at the blood test results that kind of got fast tracked. And I get a voicemail on my phone Monday. Hey, you're good. You're in the clear. I don't know what's wrong with you, but it's not that. So yeah, if you want to follow up, give me a call. Otherwise, take care.
Hope you
So
had a great weekend.
exactly, yeah. So my question for you, Lauren, is: did I blow it? Did I miss my golden window of opportunity in that 72 hours to create an economy that would then set me up for life?
So arguably you would have actually been in the right to go on social media and build the empire because at least you had what you
I could have sat down.
interpreted as a
I could have
legitimate
sat down on a
claim.
lie detector and said, I absolutely do have this. Yeah, I would have passed that. I would have passed that polygraph. But okay, the reason
Like you're talking someone who has brain cancer who never got any kind of test, like who never had a scan of any kind,
yeah.
who never had a blood test of any kind. Like, come on.
And Lauren, thank you for bailing me out. I laughed because it was my experience, and frankly, you could only laugh or cry about the absolute insanity of that 72-hour experience. So yeah, it's not to make light of what that actually feels like in the moment. It was catastrophic.
Yeah.
I was horrified. But as a person with very few emotional tools, I choose to laugh at my own expense with that one. But no, it was absolutely terrifying, and I don't mean to make light of it, except as to say, holy crap, what a time for me. Can't believe that I ever did that.
Also, to draw the parallel that, at the time you were in your mid 20s, correct?
Yeah, mid-20s.
And so at the time she was, I believe, early 20s, maybe 20, 19, something like that.
Yeah.
And the fact that her immediate reaction was to go online and speak very publicly about it, which, to each their own, right?
Yeah.
But it's not the most usual reaction to kind of launch this whole platform based on this diagnosis that's rejecting modern medicine.
Yeah, yeah. And okay, this is a serious question though. Did she really believe at first that she had it, or was this purely a fabrication? Is there any clarity on that?
We'll never know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to believe that she ever believed it.
Yeah.
Like, that's very difficult.
Yeah. And at a certain point, it's like,
Because you never go to the doctor again.
yeah, she never claimed like
No,
to go
like
back.
there was no series of treatments. There was no follow up. There wasn't a treatment plan that was in place that she then rejected. Like there was none of that. So it's very hard to believe that there was any legitimate sense of a diagnosis. I mean, there should maybe a diagnosis of another kind in the psychological
Yeah.
realm, but
I can tell you what I did when I got that diagnosis and believed it is I went, so I was near the kind of tail end of my PhD, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to punt on my early to mid 20s, go through all my schooling, and then I'll get to the really fun, good part of life where it all pays off, which is not necessarily what I'd recommend, but that's the mindset I was in my late teens to early 20s to mid 20s. So I remember I went and sat in my car for like 30 minutes and just kind of stared blankly and was like, wow, none of that is going to pay off. I'm dead and I wasted my life, which doesn't feel good. And then I called my mother, and then she was like, she told me that that it would be fine and I was going to be fine because I believe it's just a textbook case of denial where like her brain would not allow her to consider the medical realities of what any of it meant, despite the fact that she's a practicing nurse and a very good one and knew full well, like, dude, if that diagnosis is right, you are very screwed. So, yeah, I did not think, ooh, there's got to be some money in this if I can just go quickly enough. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the just absolute mess of this story, the truly dastardly deeds. And I tried to throw out, like, can we give her the benefit of the doubt? But it sounds like from everyone I've talked to about this, the answer is no. There's really not a benefit of the doubt to be given. Um, Even her friends it sounds like her friends basically outed her. And we were like, bro, you can't keep doing this. This is inherently wrong.
her friends contacted the press
Oh, man.
like to try to get journalists to look into it because they were so horrified by what she was doing.
Yeah.
And of course the like raising money for cancer, and you never give the cancer to the families that you were supposedly raising money for.
Well,
That's
yeah.
nefarious in and of itself.
Yeah, that's just the pure like fraud slash embezzlement. Depending, I'm not a prosecutor of financial crime, so I don't know the exact terminology, but okay, so this was not a good thing. This was not that not
Summary.
yeah, this was not a venture that was on the up and up. So what were the consequences of all this?
Unfortunately, lying is not a crime, so there is no criminal repercussions. Uh, but defrauding people is a crime. She was penalized by the Australian government for $500,000 or $600,000, which she to this day has not paid, and she's still out there doing her thing.
And has he
But
has he just said like I'm not going to pay it? Like no? Or has she like claimed I don't have any money and therefore I can't pay it?
I believe they have tried to kind of go to her home and try to, reclaim some assets and things like that. But, it's difficult to say what recourse they have. This kind of thing does happen where people can string it out and delay for a long time. And she's no longer on Instagram, to my knowledge. I think, presumably she's making money in other shady ways.
I mean, she could have made enough that she's pretty set, and it's just like,
Potentially.
yeah. But okay, so consequences, it looks like we're coming up blank, coming up empty, which is
Not enough.
not what you want to hear.
Yeah.
So I think moving forward, if we're not going to get the gratification of observing her, getting her comeuppance, and kind of atoning for the alleged crimes that have occurred here, we can shift our sights to the present and future. And one of the questions that I think has to come up in this kind of conversation is, uh, what can people do to protect themselves from this type of scammery? Because this type of scam is definitely unique with regards to how egregious it is. It's on a uniquely sensitive topic that a lot of people, I think, would just never consider to be in bounds, especially when I would say that the primary victims of the fraudulent claims are people who are in that position I was in, sitting in my car thinking like, and I mean, and I don't want to make like, listen, I had a bad 72 hours. Okay. I'm not, I got over it. It's fine. But if that were a real diagnosis, like I can to some extent empathize with just that feeling of, I'm really trapped here. Like I don't have a lot of good options. I'm extremely worried. I'm terrified about my
Yeah.
health and my future. This is such a uniquely vulnerable population that was the victim, the principal victim of this kind of misinformation. So all of that is to say this type of health and fitness scam is unique in how depraved it is, unique in how disgusting it is to kind of prey on that specific population of all populations. But scams are not new in health and fitness, and they're the norm rather than the exception. You know, they're all over the place and they're numerous. So what can people do to protect themselves from that?
Yeah, I think, of course, this is in a category of its own, as you said. But I don't think we should minimize the effect of some of these other scams or just misinformation in general that are linked to people's financial gain on social media these days, because there are a lot of people who are seemingly legitimate because they have an MD or they have a PhD or they cite evidence, quote unquote. And so it can be really, really difficult to know who to trust. And our exercise and nutrition and health information matters, and people deserve evidence-based recommendations, and people are trying to do what's right. And so I do think that it is bad. It's problematic that people are taking advantage of people like this, because there are a lot of individuals out there who are looking to social media for help because they their body is changing, and they want to understand why, or their doctor told them to start exercising and they want to understand how, or they've decided to prioritize health and longevity, and they want to optimize that. You know, there are various reasons why people kind of go on a health and fitness journey. And it's really unfortunate that it's so complicated and confusing for people right now. So I think a few tips would be, when you are looking at information online, look at the person, and do they seemingly have an agenda? Because sometimes people post about the same thing kind of over and over again, and the information ends with a solution that is a pitch. And so, do you have a problem? I can solve it, and here's the link to buy the product that will solve your problem. That is a red flag, because there is never a single solution to a particular problem, especially when we're talking about overall health, exercise, nutrition. There's a lot of individualization, and it's almost always going to be a lifestyle change before it's something that you purchase. So that's something that I would definitely keep in mind.
Yeah. So I like the fact that you mentioned, you know, it used to just be people with no credentials would kind of jump out and say, "Hey, I've got a wacky idea," and you could just say, "No, we're good." But now with social media, the barrier to getting out in front of people is a lot lower, and there are a lot of people out there with credentials, and a little bit like in the weeds in terms of the technicalities is it's actually kind of hard to strip people of the credentials that they're flaunting. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're a dietitian and you are giving just absolute trash advice that is not consistent with your training as a dietitian. They can strip you of your licensure, and they can prevent you from, on paper, performing
Practicing.
dietetic services in a particular state in the United States. But they're not going to like take your master's degree, right? So like you still have your credentials, just not your license to practice. Same thing goes if you're a medical doctor. There's a lot of folks, actually quite a few, that are like famous Instagram doctors, and they still have an MD. They have their medical degree from a medical school, but they've been stripped of their licensure for medical malpractice. And so it's like they're a doctor who cannot practice medicine, but they can practice flapping their gums on Instagram all day and telling you a bunch of fake stuff. And they'll always have a spin on it too. If you say, "Hey, I heard you got stripped of your licensure and you can't practice medicine anymore. Does that make you less reputable?" They go, "No, it was, you know, I was telling you stuff that big pharma doesn't want you to know, so it was all a witch hunt. It was a scam. The licensing board is in the pocket of this entity or that entity or these lobbyists." Or they'll just say, I don't need a license to practice because I'm a holistic person now, and I'm giving people totally different advice that doesn't fit in the rigid box of modern medicine." So there's always some kind of thing where they just say, "I pivoted," or "it was a witch hunt," or "my enemies did this to spite me." So you got a lot of times you won't even visibly see people who have been fully discredited in their profession and yet retain their degree, because all you see on their little Instagram handle is blah 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 MD. And you may never figure out in your entire time getting information from them that they've lost their ability to practice as a punitive measure for how terrible that their advice is. So I think it's important to be aware of that. Now, when let's say so and so scammer Dr. MD is giving advice on Instagram, and maybe they have a license to practice medicine, maybe not, but they're going through and they're dazzling you with all this mechanistic evidence and making all these claims that sound maybe too good to be true. What's like one or two things that can help someone without a really robust research background just try to do like basic fact checking of those claims to kind of see if they can, flatly reject them, or if maybe those claims hold some water?
I think if they do cite a study, which often they're doing less and less these days, or it can be confusing because they cite a narrative review, which is essentially an opinion paper that isn't actually data. But I did some digging recently into a claim that cited a narrative review, and then I went down the rabbit hole of actually looking at the references in that narrative review paper, and I realized that the only reference that this claim could be linked to was a study in mice. And so sometimes you won't have to go down that long journey. Sometimes it'll be a bit more clear, but I think generally people who are linking claims to animal model data try to make it a bit murkier. So because we can agree that human recommendations shouldn't be based on rodent model data, but
humans are animals, but we're not all animals.
No, and especially when we're thinking about metabolism and reproductive function and muscle, and not to knock rodent data, it's important, it's hypothesis generating, but it's not a basis for developing recommendations for us. Yeah. So I think looking at the population that it was studied in, and even if it was human, was it older individuals, was it younger individuals, was it trained individuals, it depends on the question, and looking also at what was the intervention, and what was the outcome. And so if the outcome of interest was something like, this is the metabolic fate of this particular amino acid or this pathway, and we're looking at the potential mechanism underpinning this, you've lost the plot there, right? Yeah. That's not practical anymore. That's mechanistically interesting, but we're not at the point where that should drive recommendations. If you're looking at a study that was a pilot study in a handful of people, that's something that needs to be replicated in a larger number of people. And then, of course, we need to look to the body of literature in general. Has this been studied many times? Has it been studied enough that there are recommendations by governing bodies like the Menopause Society, for example. These are people that are, or organizations that are really on top of the literature as it comes out, because that's an area that needs more data. And so I think we need to be careful about looking at single studies, looking at studies with very small populations, looking at studies that don't match the overall literature. But I know that everything I just said is creating a lot of work for the average person. So I empathize with them.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great if you didn't have to invest that, if you could take everything at face value, but time and time again we see that you can't, and it's not new. All right, so we saw it, with the snake oil kind of industry back in the day. Certainly, the supplement industry has numerous instances of just huge breaches in ethics and trust. We see that through line all the way to today, this recent story with apple cider vinegar. And I tell you what, to wrap up the show, I want to make a bold claim, and I'm going to put my name on it, and I'll be held accountable if I'm not right. I will venture to say, within the next 25 years, someone in health or fitness will be exposed as a scammer. How much you want to bet, Lauren?
I'll bet on that. With you.
Then we're in agreement.
We're in agreement.
All right. Well, Lauren, I think that does it for this episode. Once again, we want to thank all the good people for tuning in to Front Page Fitness. If you have any interesting headlines that you catch and you'd like to hear our opinions on it, be sure to drop us a line. Make sure that you like our videos and podcasts, subscribe on whatever platform you like. Thanks, everyone. Take care, and we will see you very soon.